What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Fencing Flops. This week we're going to be taking a look at the fencing scene from the show Arrow, from the 7th episode in the first season, Muse of Fire.
Can I talk to you? Dad? In case you haven't noticed, I'm a little occupied at the moment. I just talked to the accountant. He said my accounts were frozen. He said my credit cards were all canceled.
I pay Sandy a king's ransom each year in fees, Tommy. When it comes to money, if he says it's so,
It's so. Do you think this is a joke?
no.
So, I just took a look at the whole thing, and we're going to go back and take a look at various parts of it broken down. I just want to say right off the bat, it does look fairly accurate. I mean, right away I could see certain details that were definitely could be fixed, but for the most part, they did a fairly decent job of making it at least look pretty good. And I always do respect a show that decides to take a more complex type of fencing, in this case saber, to try and showcase it. Because for epee, at least, there's no system of priorities, so it's fairly easy to show without really, going into the specifics of it, and that's where they run into problems of possibly getting something wrong. Saber is one of the more difficult ones to show and to be correct about everything, so I always kind of appreciate the effort that studios put in if they choose Saber over foil or epee. But let's go ahead and take a look at it. First of all, right off the bat, while they are doing dry fencing, which means they're not hooked up to any machines or anything, they do have the right equipment. Now, technically speaking, their masks are silver, which means they are designed to be hooked up to a machine. Every saber fencer I've ever met uses the same mask for dry fencing and drills and stuff like that as they do for when they're actually on a strip. I think the most in terms of having different masks that I've ever seen is they'll have two electric masks, one for tournaments and one for practice, because if you use it for long enough, then eventually the masks will stop responding and they'll acquire what are called dead spots, where basically a little area of the mask or equipment will start shorting out, usually because sweat and wear and tear, and it won't respond anymore. Once an electric mask or another piece of equipment that is meant to be scored upon has too much of a dead spot, then eventually it can't pass inspection and they don't allow it in certain tournaments. But it can be used for practice. So there's kind of a buffer there. So they do have all the right equipment, which is nice. So now let's take a closer look at how they're actually moving.
Can I talk to you?
So, there's that first little exchange right off the bat. So just because of where they are, the fact that there's only two of them, and the fact that they're not hooked up to a machine, immediately indicates that this is practice, that they're just following drills. If that is the case, they're doing something correct that might otherwise be wrong if they were actually doing any sort of open fencing, which is basically the fact that all their movements are sort of split up. They have what looks to be very choreographed movements, but more importantly, they're not in constant motion. The thing is, saber fencers are pretty much always in motion. They might slow down, and they might speed up, and they'll travel at, different speeds, but it's extremely rare for them to actually stop. And if they do stop for strategic purposes, then it's never for very long. It's for literally just a split second. What they're doing here, just because of their tempo, they have, they exchange a few actions and then they stop, they kind of assess each other and then go back at it. That looks to be closer to any sort of drill. Now, I don't know what kind of drill it is, because the thing is, like I said before, it looks very choreographed. But I can't really tell if that's because of the fact that this is just being filmed on a TV set, or because they're doing a set of drills and practices or scales or something like that, where you know what your opponent is going to do and you're just kind of going through the motions, committing something to muscle memory, something like that. So I'm not really sure if it is a drill because I can't tell if it is a drill what kind of drill it would be. So they have the tempo and the timing for this to be a drill, but I don't really see a goal for it. So it kind of it's kind of missing something that really sets it in the category of either open fencing or drill. But the other thing that I want to bring up, there are actually two things, but one of them is happening right now. The thing is, they're using their entire arm, and it looks like with all their attacks, their point of contact is very far down the blade. They're hitting with either the middle of their blade or closer in the fort of their blade, which is the lower half of the blade. That is not what you want to do. In saber fencing, you can score with the entire length of the blade, so technically it's not against the rules to do that. But it's not a good idea. Saber fencers practice hitting with the very tip of their blade. Generally speaking, the lower half of the blade is for defense and the outer half of the blade is for offense. But the further away that you can hit your opponent, the better. Because the thing is, if you hit your opponent with pretty much anything closer, like anywhere in the first 2/3 of your blade, then, like I said, it's legal, but it means that your positioning is off. You're too close to your opponent, or you waited too long, or it might even mean that your opponent got the drop on you. So even though it's allowed, it's never a good idea. And if it does happen, it's an indicator that something has gone wrong. I know from experience in pretty much every drill and practice and basically controlled fencing scenario that I've ever gone through in Saber, we always drill it so that you're only hitting them with like the last inch of your blade. That's how important it is, because if you're doing these wide sweeping motions, then that takes longer, it's slower. There's also like these like outer inches, like the very end of your blade is not within your control. You're utilizing your control around the middle of your blade when it should be at the very end of it. This will greatly increase your efficiency and your range. Yeah, that's immediately the first thing that I see. Like these are the movements of beginners who came in because they saw like Pirates of the Caribbean or something, and that's how they're fencing. The other thing that I want to bring up is their form. Now, looking at their stances aren't too bad. They're not really doing a whole lot of footwork, which is another reason I think this might be some sort of drill instead of an open practice. But the movement that they are doing and their on-guard positioning and everything, it's not perfect, but it's definitely within the realm of possibility. This is the kind of thing that you see a lot of people who have been fencing for years doing. So it's not that bad. The thing that is rather unrealistic is the arm behind the back. Now, in classical fencing, and a long time ago when classical fencing was essentially modern fencing, the back arm was up like this. Something very similar to that was keeping the arm behind the back. Now, I suppose this isn't my area of expertise, but I suppose that with a sharpened blade, you would want to make sure that everything that can be cut is as protected as possible. And it's probably a lot easier to just place your arm behind your back as a way to shield it rather than, covering it in more armor. But I don't really know. Like I said, that's not my area of expertise. But in modern fencing, it's not really done anymore. I've seen some people do it if they're the type of people who don't have access to a modern competitive club. Usually if they're learning on their own or something like that, it's something that they might think is a good idea, particularly in epee and saber, Because the thing is, in both Epee and Saber, the back arm is a valid target area. So they place it behind their back, or they're more likely to. The fact that this is a good idea is a common misconception. The problem is that with your back arm behind you, that actually starts to throw off your entire torso. It starts to pull you back, and it's just not very comfortable. And what I mean by pulling back is that with your arm kind of fixed behind your back, it will actually start to pull that shoulder back, which will start to pull your torso back, which will start to extend that same effect down to your fencing arm and, more importantly, your feet. Having your arm behind your back is a bad idea because the more used to it you are, the more likely it is that your whole position will start to come out of alignment. You want your body aligned at a certain angle to your opponent, but if you put your arm behind your back, then that will start to pull everything that should be facing your opponent off to the side. And then that will affect not only how your opponent is able to hit you, but how you're able to defend against it. So let's keep going.
Dad? In case you haven't noticed, I'm a little occupied at the moment. I just talked to the accountant. He said my accounts were...
Okay, I want to stop it again despite the fact that it's pretty soon. First of all, even if this is a drill and therefore a more controlled scenario, never stand that close to someone. Like, this whole exchange that I'm watching with this character in a suit, with how close he is to the two fencers, I'm just, like, internally cringing the whole time. Because, you know, from the camera's position, it is kind of hard to tell where exactly he is, so I can't really say, you know, if he's too close or not. But he definitely looks closer than normal. And that's just, like, even if you're drilling, something can go wrong, and then the next thing you know, you get whipped across the face because you were standing so close and you weren't wearing a mask. So that's the first thing. That's kind of a safety hazard. The second thing is something I kind of suspected when I watched this the first time, but now I definitely see it. If you see right here, he's gripping it in a certain way that you don't want to do. So the way he's gripping it is with his thumb kind of encircling the grip with his fingers, and then the rest of the grip just kind of fits into the palm of his hand. This is not how you do it. You want to use the middle part of your forefinger and your thumb to pinch the very top of the grip. And then the rest of the grip settles into your hand, and then your other three fingers come up and settle around it to act as extra support, and in the case of Saber, to aid the very last of the cutting action in most attacks. Because a lot of the finer details of the very end of an attack are actually coordinated with the fingers and a bit of the wrist. It's not really done with the arm. Because if you can control it properly, you can get a good couple inches of cutting range with a very, very small action. He's basically holding it like a hammer and not like a weapon. That's pretty much an oversight. That's not something that a beginner would be doing because obviously you're taught how to hold the weapon pretty much right off the bat. As soon as they give you a weapon, they teach you how to hold it. So this is something that it looks like, this is just a detail that they overlooked, but it's something that would have been addressed right away for anyone taking a class. But those are two small details. I guess they can be forgiven, but still, they're trying to make it seem like he's a really good fencer, that he really knows what he's doing, that he's devoted to his training, but you can see from how he holds it, that's not true. But let's keep going.
And he said my credit cards were all canceled.
I pay Sandy a king's ransom each year in fees, Tommy. When it comes to money, if he says it's so, it's so.
So that's the end of it. I guess the last thing that I want to bring up that I didn't really point out before was something that I actually kind of appreciated. It was something that I liked that they thought of it, but they didn't really pull it off quite right. But I appreciated the effort. And that was these little clips right here, where instead of a direct parry, they're actually just doing something called displacing target, which means that instead of using their blade to guard themselves, they're using something else, distance. They're moving out of the way. Now, they're not doing it quite right. They're sort of making these big actions with their arms to sort of show off what they're doing. That's not something that would actually work. I don't see any real footwork there. In an actual fencing scenario, how they do it would not work. But like I said, I like the fact that they actually put it in there. Because, I mean, I can tell you from experience, when a lot of people are learning Saber and you start bringing up the fact that you can, just back up out of the way, that you can use purely footwork as a very viable defense, a surprising number of people are surprised. They think that, footwork is just there to get you to your opponent. And that's only half true. The other half is it's there to get you away from your opponent. And if you can do it correctly timed, then it can actually set you up in a much better position to start your own attack than if you had parried them. And a lot of times, actually pretty much every fencer, I was going to say most saber fencers, but then I realized this kind of applies to saber, epee, and foil, and that is they will not just parry their opponent, but combine the parry with at least one retreat in order to make the parry more effective. But it is possible to defend yourself by just using retreats and crossbacks and jumping backwards to make sure that your opponent misses, to make them fall short. I like that they threw it in, but they didn't quite do it too well. And it wasn't so much the fact that they didn't study it, it was more the fact that they intentionally gave it a little too much dramatic flair, I would say. But that's pretty much the end of that. It wasn't actually too bad. There were a few things they did that were, kind of glaringly obvious to pretty much any saber fencer, but it wasn't a total dumpster fire. So I guess for this scene, I can't give it too many points, mainly because, like I said, I couldn't tell if it was a drill or if they were actually practicing fencing. So I would give this scene a score of 6 out of 10. They got some things right, but there were some things they could have done better. But that's the end of that, and I will see you next week. Bye.